Thank you so much for coming. I'm glad you're all curious to find out. So what does it mean for both Leavers and Remainers to invoke the apocalypse as a narrative to describe either a soft or any Brexit? Might Armageddon and disaster be descriptors in of themselves, or could they be drawing on a whole other chain of associations? Are they often about directing violence at another group of people, or claiming your group is under attack, or offering people some kind of strong-armed military male figure who's going to sweep away all of the feelings of powerlessness that you experience? So the sense of being out of control is very palpable for both Leavers and Remainers at the moment. And the apocalypse really comes to the fore in this imagination. So you take The Guardian, for example. There's this wonderful quote that was published over the summer. Future historians might well marvel at the way Brexit became an external, irresistible, unstoppable force over which we have no control, like a natural disaster. Simon Jenkins went even further, describing it as a dystopian Blade Runner Brexit, exclaiming, "May must seize control." And it's really interesting to just see how that rhetorical strategy is increasingly being adopted by Remainers. So Gina Miller, in particular, has been giving a number of speeches over the last year saying Remainers must take back control. And I'm really interested in what the stakes of that are, as either a desire or a promise to people. A lot of the criticisms of Brexit from the Remainer side often turns to imagery of floods, leaking, boats going over waterfalls. And these are kind of tapping into metaphors of powerlessness, of, almost like traumatically being out of control. A video that went viral this year was Brexit Means Titanic, in which contemporary politicians, and including as you see the top hand corner, the red bus, was photoshopped over the 1997 film. David Cameron gave his resignation speech in which he said he cannot be the captain to steer the ship anymore before he's promptly drowned. Boris Johnson is a child being smuggled onto life rafts. The pound symbolically falls off the back. And then the hull is lit up with the voting divisions and then splits in two, collapses into the sea. And Theresa May spouts platitudes of how great it's going to be to a very baffled audience of other people on the life rafts. And then in the very final scene, Nigel Farage draws a nude Donald Trump, who's obviously had his face pasted over a woman's body. In order for this to work as a joke, though, it's implicitly homophobic. There's something implicitly negative about a man drawing another man naked. So there's obviously a very complex gender politics going on, not least the representation of Trump as a woman or Johnson as a child, where women and children are often used as metaphors of powerlessness in a certain kind of collective imagination. Our society has long seen masculinity as a spectrum. You can have too much of it or you can have too little, and both are a bad thing. Both are seen as being out of control. It's only the figure in the middle that's meant to be a subject in control, and therefore supposedly must act as a benign custodian for all those who are imagined not to be able to. Effeminate men, women, children, LGBTQ people, those deemed foreign, animals, you name it. And you can see with this Remainer image on the right how certain misogynistic tropes start to creep into that visual culture. So it says at the bottom, putting the N in cuts. Posh, chubby, adult baby. wankersoftheworld.com. And these things are using femininity or effeminacy or non-procreative sexuality as an insult, as a metaphor for powerlessness. And haunting behind that is the implication that there needs to be some kind of strong-armed military male figure who's going to take back control and make everyone feel more reassured. And you can see how masculinity has really emerged as a battleground in the kind of Brexit discourse. So here's Nadine Dorries tweeting about the then Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, explaining that he's ex-SAS. He's trained to survive. He's also trained to take people out, as though these were useful negotiation skills. I was listening to BBC Any Answers, kind of phone-in programme, where people talk about the week's politics, and I was really struck in June. One of the callers, just a member of the public, said, "If we leave the European Union, we will be a small boy." And then 24 hours later, The Guardian ran this article saying that a Britain that will decline into a sullen and impoverished island will be like a divorced man drinking alone in a bedsit. So there's masculinity is a particular point of anxiety here, and the desire for a kind of real man to emerge. Now, Leavers have frequently mocked Remainer apocalypticism, but the reason that they haven't really gained traction for this is because British nationalists for a long time have been declaring the end of Britain, particularly in the decade after the financial crisis. So from 2008, the abolition of Britain, to 2016, Titanic Britain, there's this whole kind of conceptual imagination blaming the EU and immigration for killing the country. In fact, the whole demand to take back control was precisely persuasive for a certain electorate in that environment where it felt like, or a certain group of people being told that Britain is about to end. And in fact, Leave.eu repeatedly put out memes suggesting Theresa May is either killing the Conservative Party or the UK as a whole. So there's a huge strand of apocalypticism in the kind of Leaver imagination. And you just have to turn to one newspaper like The Times to see the hunger for a kind of male saviour figure. These are just a few newspaper articles from the last few months. There's a hole in the centre made for a saviour. Our timid leaders can learn from strong men. End of days feel in Westminster crying out for strong leadership. What's particularly bizarre or disturbing about the last account in particular is it opens with a description of a Tory MP sending the journalist a video of armed men gunning down a passenger in a car as a way of explaining their philosophy of a hard Brexit. If we were to look for a slightly more explicit manifestation of that metaphor, the Tory MP Bernard Jenkin wrote in The Sun recently, promising that Brexit victory would be like winning the Falklands War. And you can really see how war and the apocalypse are really wrapped up quite closely together here. Surrender would destroy the Conservative Party. We cannot allow the EU to defeat the British people. So that militarism is absolutely the context here for the kind of end of the world discourse. Boris Johnson is obviously a particularly fascinating subject of study. And he's knee-deep in, metaphors that are particularly anxious about masculinity. But he recently described the negotiation process as a humiliation. And this is a really specific image. We look like a 7-stone weakling being comically bent out of shape by a 500-pound gorilla. So if you think back to that, the masculinity spectrum I showed earlier, his concern is about the fragility, the weakness, the not being mighty or strong or pummeling someone else. And the thing about the animal imagery is it's a classic militarism tactic to paint those you see as your enemy as an animal. They're aggressive, they're out of control, they're in need of containment, they're in need of some form of zoological confinement. or their lives are disposable. So it really runs through a kind of war imagination. And here in particular, you can see just how apocalyptic Johnson's thinking is. He has this, particularly awful phrase, "We have wrapped a suicide vest around our constitution." He describes the Irish backstop as the origin of the disaster. The Irish backstop is a monstrosity that wipes out our sovereignty. And what becomes really clear here is just how much the end of the world as a narrative is a way of redirecting violence out at another group and claiming that you've got all the answers and you're going to make people feel back in control. And this is in a climate in which both Leavers and Remainers are increasingly using that as a rhetorical strategy. So at the recent Tory party conference, Boris Johnson said of the Chequers plan, "This is not taking back control, it is forfeiting control." Well, the next day outside the conference venue, Remain protesters held a funeral saying, "We've now lost control." And I think we need to, this is an opportunity to pause and think about this and ask ourselves whether we should be a little bit skeptical about that desire to be in control all the time, or what the political stakes of that might be. This is a far-right meme that's been going around the internet showing the Mayor of London hanging Tommy Robinson, the far-right activist. And this is I put this in here because it's a really clear example of just how dangerous and the ultimate stakes of that end of the world thinking run to, that imagination that we're under threat, we must attack them back. This is also an artwork by Rachel McLean. It's a VR Brexit artwork. So you put on goggles and headphones and you're immersed in this London street that's pouring down with rain. It's full of these kind of strange inflatable tourist souvenirs. And it's deliberately kind of unpicking and playing with that kind of sense of apocalypticism, but really drives home some of the horror and the implication of violence in it as well. So you're being harangued by these very wealthy passers-by who are badgering you for money. And you have this smartphone that you can take photos with in this immersive environment. Anyway, and one of them tells you, just ignore them, don't worry about it, and says, well, take a picture of me. And this smartphone you're holding has been transformed into a weapon without you realizing it. And when you click it, you shoot them and they die. And then all of these other figures emerge and start pummeling you, and you fire at them, but eventually everything fades to red, then cuts to black, and you can just hear this heavy breathing. And this, as an artwork, seemed to not just pick up on a UK that's increasingly becoming riven by those internal conflicts and divisions, but also in some of it really had the traces of how, that kind of horrific violence that came with that. So I think now is a really important moment for us to stop and think about powerlessness and how we're all feeling in the midst of some really messy, complex negotiations. Because while people from all sides are promising the electorate that they can give them back control, we might have to really reevaluate whether any of us, some more than others, but whether any of us can really be in absolute control of our lives anyway. And what's at stake? Particularly if we've long understood control through that military male figure, and it's really based on controlling other people. Maybe we need to reevaluate it as a framework for politics or society or imagination. Maybe this is also a time to reevaluate the stakes of the UK on the world stage, where we're no longer as powerful or, ruling the waves as some kind of Brexiteer colonial fantasy. We are actually much smaller and much more insignificant, and we will feel an intense form of powerlessness wrapped up in that. And rather than necessarily lashing out and looking for kind of armed macho male figures to strike out and direct violence at others, maybe we should contemplate coming to terms with how entangled we are with each other, how interdependent, messy and complicated, and the way that we all impinge on each other. We can't have complete mastery of our own lives. We have to a certain extent, coexist. So thank you.